Standing in the front row at my grandmother's funeral, I clutched my phone with trembling fingers, knowing I was about to destroy everything my family believed about themselves. The recording I'd discovered just 3 days earlier was still fresh in my mind, every cruel word burned into my memory. As my cousin Marcus stepped up to deliver what everyone expected to be a touching eulogy about our beloved matriarch, I knew I had exactly 60 seconds before I would either stay silent forever or change everything. The woman they were about to memorialize as a saint had called me the family disappointment just weeks before her death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that she'd recorded every conversation, every family gathering, every private moment for the past 5 years. And what I'd found on those recordings would shatter the perfect image my family had built around Margaret Sullivan. My name is Sarah Chen, and until 3 weeks ago I thought I knew exactly who I was in my family, the disappointment, the one who never quite measured up. The granddaughter who chose teaching over medicine, who lived in a tiny apartment instead of buying property, who was still single at 32 while my cousins collected spouses and children like trophies. I was the one who got eye rolls when I spoke at family dinners, the one whose achievements were met with polite smiles and quick subject changes. For as long as I could remember, my grandmother Margaret had made it crystal clear that I was the weak link in the Sullivan family chain. We were successful people, she'd remind me regularly. We were doctors and lawyers and business owners. We didn't waste our lives on frivolous pursuits like education that barely paid the bills. When I'd graduated with my master's degree in elementary education, she'd given me a check for $50 and told me it was probably more than I'd make in a month teaching little brats who don't want to learn anyway. The Sullivan family had always been about image, about success that could be measured in dollars and status symbols. My grandfather Patrick had built a construction empire from nothing, starting with a single truck and ending with Sullivan Sons Construction, one of the largest companies in the Pacific Northwest. When he died 15 years ago, my grandmother Margaret took over the business side while my father and uncle ran operations. The company was worth millions, employed hundreds of people, and had built half the commercial buildings in Seattle. Growing up, Sunday dinners at Grandma Margaret's house in Queen Anne were mandatory affairs. The house itself was a testament to Sullivan's success, a sprawling Tudor revival that overlooked Elliott Bay, filled with expensive furniture and artwork that screamed old money even though our money was barely a generation deep. Margaret would hold court at the head of the massive dining room table, questioning each grandchild about their achievements, their grades, their future plans. My cousins always had the right answers. Marcus, 2 years older than me, was pre-med at University of Washington and could recite his GPA to 3 decimal places. His younger brother David was already talking about law school as a freshman. My cousin Rebecca, Uncle Tommy's daughter, was majoring in business administration with plans to join the family company. Even my baby cousin Emma, still in high school, was taking advanced placement classes and talking about becoming a surgeon. Then there was me. Sarah, who wanted to teach 2nd grade. Sarah, who got a full scholarship to Western Washington University but chose education over pre-med. Sarah, who actually loved working with children and found joy in helping struggling readers discover books. Sarah, who thought success meant making a difference rather than making money. Teaching is a hobby, not a career, Margaret had announced during one particularly memorable Sunday dinner when I was 25. It's what women do when they can't handle real work. My own mother taught school, and she always regretted not pushing herself harder. You're wasting your potential, Sarah. You're smart enough to be a doctor like Marcus, but you're choosing to babysit children instead. The words had stung because they came wrapped in what sounded like concern. Margaret never screamed or lost her temper. She delivered her criticisms with the precision of a surgeon, always in front of the whole family, always with that slight smile that suggested she was helping me see the truth about myself. The rest of the family would nod along or change the subject, leaving me to sit there feeling small and foolish for ever thinking my dreams mattered. My parents, Dad and Mom, had tried to defend me in their own way, but they were caught between supporting their daughter and maintaining peace with Margaret, who controlled not just the family business but the family dynamics entirely. Dad worked for Sullivan and Sons and couldn't afford to alienate his mother. Mom, who had given up her own nursing career when she married Dad, seemed to understand my position but lacked the power to challenge Margaret directly. The breaking point had come 6 months before Margaret's death. I'd been nominated for Teacher of the Year in my district, an honor that meant everything to me and my students. When I'd shared the news at Sunday dinner, expecting at least polite congratulations, Margaret had actually laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh that makes your stomach drop. Teacher of the Year, she'd repeated, shaking her head. What's next, Sarah? Mother of the Year for the children you don't have. Wife of the Year for the husband you can't seem to find. These participation trophies don't mean anything in the real world. Marcus just got accepted to Johns Hopkins for his residency. That's an actual achievement. The room had gone quiet except for the sound of forks against plates. Marcus had looked uncomfortable, but he hadn't said anything. Neither had anyone else. They'd all just sat there while Margaret systematically dismantled what should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. I'd excused myself and gone to the bathroom to cry, something I'd done countless times over the years in that house. When I'd come back, they were discussing Marcus's residency plans as if nothing had happened. As if my dreams and accomplishments were so insignificant they weren't worth even acknowledging. That night, I'd driven home to my Capitol Hill apartment and seriously considered cutting ties with the family entirely. The emotional exhaustion of constantly being made to feel inadequate was taking its toll on every aspect of my life. I'd started avoiding dating because I could hear Margaret's voice in my head criticizing any man I brought around. I'd stopped sharing professional successes because I knew they'd be dismissed or compared unfavorably to my cousin's achievements. But Margaret Sullivan wasn't just my grandmother. She was the matriarch of a family that, despite its flaws, had been my whole world growing up. The woman who'd taught me to play chess when I was 7, even though she'd later use those games to lecture me about thinking strategically in life. The woman who'd taken me to get my ears pierced for my 13th birthday, even though she'd spent the whole day telling me I needed to start thinking about how I presented myself to the world. Margaret was complicated in the way that family members often are. She could be cruel and dismissive, but she could also be fiercely protective when outsiders threatened any of us. When my high school boyfriend had cheated on me, she'd shown up at his house and had a conversation with his parents that resulted in a formal apology letter. When a teacher had unfairly failed me on a project in college, she'd made some phone calls that got the grade reviewed and changed. Her love came with conditions and criticisms, but it was still love, even if it often felt more like a transaction than an emotion. She expected excellence because she believed we were capable of it. She pushed us because she'd grown up poor and understood that success required sacrifice and single-minded determination. The problem was that her definition of success was narrow and inflexible, leaving no room for paths that didn't lead directly to wealth and traditional markers of achievement. The Sullivan family story was one that Margaret told often and with obvious pride. Her husband Patrick had arrived in Seattle from Ireland with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. He'd started doing odd construction jobs, saved every penny, and slowly built a business that became a dynasty. Margaret had been the daughter of a seamstress, smart and ambitious, but limited by the opportunities available to women in the 1960s. She'd married Patrick and poured all her intelligence and drive into building the family business and raising successful children. Their 2 sons, my father Michael and my uncle Tommy, had both joined the company and helped expand it beyond Patrick's wildest dreams. They'd married good women who understood the importance of family loyalty and raising children who would continue the Sullivan legacy. When Patrick died suddenly of a heart attack, Margaret had stepped into his role without missing a beat, proving that she'd been the strategic mind behind the operation all along. The grandchildren were her legacy project. We were the 3rd generation, the proof that the Sullivan rise from poverty to prosperity would continue. Marcus and David would become doctors, bringing prestige to the family name. Rebecca would bring her business degree into the company and perhaps take over operations someday. Emma would follow whatever path led to the most success and status. And then there was me, the genetic anomaly who wanted to spend my life in an elementary school classroom making $38,000 a year. In Margaret's mind, I represented everything she'd fought against her entire life: contentment with mediocrity, satisfaction with just getting by, a dangerous lack of ambition that could contaminate the whole family if left unchecked. What made it worse was that I wasn't actually mediocre. I'd graduated summa cum laude from college, earned my master's degree with a perfect GPA, and had been consistently recognized as an outstanding educator. But none of that mattered because teaching wasn't prestigious enough, wasn't lucrative enough, wasn't impressive enough to mention at Margaret's bridge club or country club functions. The irony was that I'd inherited more of Margaret's actual personality than any of my cousins. I was stubborn and determined, willing to work harder than anyone else to achieve my goals, and completely unwilling to compromise my values for convenience. But because my goals didn't align with her vision of success, those traits were seen as character flaws, rather than family strengths. Over the years, I'd tried various approaches to winning Margaret's approval, or at least her respect. I'd attempted to explain why teaching mattered, how education was the foundation that made all other professions possible. I'd shown her letters from parents, thanking me for helping their children learn to read. I'd tried to demonstrate that my work had value beyond its salary. Nothing worked. Margaret's worldview was too fixed, too deeply rooted in her own experiences of fighting for every advantage and opportunity. She couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily choose a path that offered less money, less status, less security. In her mind, I was either stupid, which she knew I wasn't, or lazy, which was somehow worse. The last conversation I'd had with Margaret before her final illness had been particularly painful. I'd been selected to present at a national education conference about innovative reading programs, an honor that represented recognition from my peers across the country. When I'd mentioned it during a family barbecue at her house, she'd actually sighed and shaken her head. "Sarah, honey, you're 32 years old," she'd said, using that patient tone that made me feel like a confused child. "When are you going to stop playing school and start building a real life? Marcus is saving lives as a doctor. David is making partner at his law firm. Rebecca just bought her second rental property. Even Emma has a business plan for after college. What do you have to show for all these years besides a classroom full of other people's children and a stack of meaningless certificates?" I'd tried to explain that my work was real, that the children I taught would become doctors and lawyers and business owners themselves, that education was the foundation everything else was built on. She'd listened with that polite, slightly bored expression that meant she was humoring me until I finished talking so she could return to adult conversation. "That's a lovely way to rationalize your choices," she'd said finally. "But you can't eat idealism, and you can't retire on good intentions. I won't be around forever to worry about you, Sarah. You need to start thinking practically about your future." That conversation had happened 3 months before her stroke. 3 months before everything changed, in ways none of us could have predicted. 3 months before I would discover that Margaret Sullivan had been keeping secrets that would redefine everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. Margaret's stroke came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March. She'd been having coffee in her sunroom, reading the Wall Street Journal, and making notes for a Sullivan Sons board meeting, when the housekeeper found her slumped over in her chair, unable to speak or move her right side. The paramedics said later that the quick response probably saved her life, but the damage had been done. The woman who had ruled our family with sharp intelligence and sharper words was suddenly unable to communicate beyond basic gestures. The doctors explained that she could understand everything being said to her, but the part of her brain that controlled speech had been severely affected. She might recover some function with therapy, they said, but it would be a long process with no guarantees. Our family rallied in the way that families do during crises. Dad and Uncle Tommy took turns staying at the hospital while also trying to manage the business without their mother's guidance. The cousins visited daily, bringing flowers and magazines and attempting cheerful one-sided conversations. My parents and aunt and uncle made arrangements for round-the-clock care once Margaret was stable enough to return home. I found myself at the hospital more than anyone else, partly because my teacher schedule was more flexible than everyone else's demanding careers, but mostly because I couldn't stand the thought of Margaret being alone with her thoughts and fears.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Whatever our relationship had been, She was still my grandmother, and seeing her so vulnerable and frustrated brought out protective instincts I didn't know I had. Margaret had always been someone who controlled every situation through the force of her personality and intellect. Now she was trapped in a body that wouldn't obey her, and couldn't express the thoughts that were clearly still racing through her mind. The helplessness in her eyes during those first weeks was heartbreaking, even for someone who had spent years being the target of her criticism. I started bringing books to read aloud during my visits, choosing mystery novels and biographies that I thought might interest her. She couldn't respond verbally, but I could see her following the stories, sometimes getting frustrated when I'd leave cliffhangers unresolved. Gradually, I began talking to her about my work, describing the funny things my students had said or the breakthroughs we'd achieved in class. To my surprise, Margaret seemed genuinely interested. She'd nod when I talked about particularly challenging students, frown when I described administrative difficulties, and even smile slightly when I shared success stories. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my grandmother was actually listening to me without judgment or dismissal. The doctors had warned us that stroke patients often experienced personality changes, and that Margaret might seem different as she recovered. What they hadn't warned us about was how those changes might actually improve relationships that had been strained for years. Without her ability to voice criticism or deliver cutting remarks, Margaret seemed to soften in ways that surprised everyone. 3 weeks after the stroke, Margaret was moved back to her Queen Anne house with a team of nurses and therapists. The family took turns sitting with her, partly to provide company and partly to monitor her care. It was during one of these evening shifts that I discovered Margaret's secret recording system. I'd been reading to her from a John le Carré novel when she became agitated, pointing repeatedly toward her bedroom with increasing frustration. Thinking she needed something from her nightstand, I'd gone to investigate, but she'd shaken her head vigorously when I'd offered various items. Finally, she'd managed to make a writing motion with her left hand, and I'd brought her a notebook and pen. With great difficulty, she'd scrawled desk drawer in shaky letters, then bottom and key. It had taken some exploration, but I'd finally found a small key taped to the underside of the bottom drawer of her ornate secretary desk. The key opened a locked compartment I hadn't even known existed, revealing a sophisticated digital recording device and a collection of labeled flash drives spanning the past 5 years. At first, I'd assumed it was some kind of business security measure. Margaret had always been paranoid about corporate espionage and had insisted on recording important meetings and phone calls. But as I'd examined the drives more closely, I'd realized they were labeled with family events. Thanksgiving 2019, Marcus graduation party, Easter dinner 2020, Sarah teacher award announcement. Margaret had been recording our family gatherings. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday celebration, every casual visit had been captured without anyone's knowledge or consent. The realization had been disturbing enough, but what I'd discovered when I'd started listening to the recordings had been earth-shattering. Margaret Sullivan, the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was the family disappointment, had been carefully documenting every cruel comment, every dismissive remark, every moment when my achievements had been minimized or ignored. But she hadn't been collecting evidence against me. She'd been collecting evidence against everyone else. The first recording I'd listened to was from my Teacher of the Year announcement 6 months earlier. I'd expected to hear Margaret's harsh laughter and cutting remarks about participation trophies. Instead, I'd heard her turning to Marcus after I'd left the room and saying, "You should be ashamed of yourself for not standing up for your cousin. Sarah works harder than any of you kids, and she's making a real difference in the world. But you all sit there like sheep while I test whether you have the backbone to defend each other." The recording had continued with Margaret explaining to the family that she'd been deliberately harsh with me to see if anyone would come to my defense. She'd been waiting for years for someone to tell her she was wrong about teaching, to argue that my work mattered, to show that they valued me for who I was rather than who she wanted me to be. "Sarah is the strongest one of all of you," she'd continued on the recording. "She chose a career that fulfilled her despite knowing I'd disapprove. She's stuck to her principles even when it would have been easier to give up and go to medical school or business school. But not one of you has ever bothered to defend her or even try to understand what she does. You're all so concerned with staying in my good graces that you'll watch me tear down your own family member." I'd sat in Margaret's bedroom, holding the flash drive with shaking hands, as my understanding of 32 years of family dynamics completely shifted. The grandmother who I'd thought saw me as a failure had actually seen me as the success story. The family members I'd thought were superior to me had been failing her tests of character and loyalty for years. There were hours of recordings, documenting conversations that had happened when I wasn't present. Margaret talking to my parents about how proud she was of my teaching awards, how she wished they would support me more publicly. Margaret telling Uncle Tommy that Rebecca needed to develop more backbone and independent thinking instead of just agreeing with whatever would advance her career. Margaret expressing disappointment that Marcus and David were so focused on status and money that they'd lost sight of the actual purpose of their chosen professions. Most shocking of all were the recordings of Margaret's private conversations with her attorney and financial advisor. She'd been planning for years to leave the bulk of her estate not to the family members who'd spent the most time trying to impress her, but to the one who'd impressed her by staying true to herself despite the cost. Margaret Sullivan had been playing a decades-long game, and I was the only one who'd been winning without knowing the rules. The recordings revealed a woman far more complex and strategic than any of us had realized. Margaret hadn't been cruel to me out of disappointment or disapproval. She'd been testing my resolve while simultaneously testing everyone else's character. She'd wanted to see if I would compromise my values to gain her approval, and she'd wanted to see if my family members would sacrifice me to maintain their standing with her. I'd passed her test by refusing to change who I was. Everyone else had failed by being willing to watch me be diminished rather than risk their own positions in the family hierarchy. But there was more, so much more than family drama and manipulation. The recordings documented business conversations, financial discussions, and legal arrangements that painted a picture of the Sullivan family empire that none of us grandchildren had ever seen. Margaret hadn't just been the matriarch of our family. She'd been the architect of a vast network of investments, properties, and business interests that extended far beyond Sullivan Sons Construction. The woman who'd criticized me for not being ambitious enough had built a financial empire that dwarfed what any of us had imagined. And according to the legal documents hidden in the same compartment as the recording equipment, she'd structured her will in a way that would reward the grandchild who'd shown the most integrity and independence. Me, the family disappointment who was about to inherit everything. Margaret died 4 days after I'd discovered her secret. The final stroke came in her sleep, peaceful and sudden, leaving behind a family that thought they knew exactly how her will would be structured and a granddaughter who knew they were all in for the shock of their lives. The funeral was everything Margaret would have wanted, elegant, well-attended, and focused on celebrating the success she'd built rather than mourning her loss. The church was filled with business associates, community leaders, and family friends who'd known her as a pillar of Seattle society. My cousins delivered eulogies that painted her as a loving grandmother who'd taught them the value of hard work and family loyalty. I sat in the front row, listening to them rewrite history with every word. Marcus talked about how Margaret had always encouraged his medical career and supported his dreams. Rebecca spoke about the business wisdom Margaret had shared and how she'd inspired her entrepreneurial spirit. David mentioned the life lessons she'd taught about perseverance and integrity. Not one of them mentioned me. Not one of them acknowledged that Margaret had been anything other than universally supportive and encouraging. They'd created a narrative where they were the beloved grandchildren who'd made her proud, and I was simply the one who'd never quite lived up to expectations. As Marcus began to conclude his eulogy with a story about Margaret's final birthday party, I made my decision. I pulled out my phone, connected it to the church's sound system through the AV setup I'd helped install as part of my volunteer work, and pressed play on the recording I'd selected. Margaret's voice filled the church, clear and strong and utterly damning. The problem with my family is that they've confused success with character. They think because they make good money and have impressive titles, they're good people. But good people don't stand by silently while someone they claim to love is being torn down. Good people don't sacrifice family loyalty for personal advantage. Sarah is the only one who's shown me what real strength looks like, and she's the only one who deserves what I've built. The silence that followed was deafening. The church erupted in chaos. Margaret's voice had carried clearly through every pew, her words cutting through the reverent atmosphere like a blade through silk. I watched as my cousin Marcus stumbled backward from the podium, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and dawning horror as he realized what had just happened. Uncle Tommy was the first to recover, jumping to his feet and pointing at me with shaking fingers. "Turn that off," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Turn it off right now." But I didn't move. I sat perfectly still in the front row, watching my family's carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. Margaret's voice continued from the speakers, relentless and clear. "Rebecca thinks she's business-minded because she can manipulate numbers and people, but she's never created anything meaningful in her life. David believes his law degree makes him intelligent, but he's never had an original thought that wasn't handed to him by someone else. And Marcus, my supposed pride and joy, is so concerned with his image as a successful doctor that he's forgotten medicine is supposed to be about helping people, not building a reputation." The funeral attendees sat frozen, uncertain whether this was some kind of planned tribute or a catastrophic malfunction. Business associates who had known Margaret for decades looked around uncomfortably, while family friends exchanged bewildered glances. The pastor stood at the side of the altar, clearly unsure whether he should intervene or let whatever was happening play out. Dad had gone completely white, gripping the edge of the pew so tightly his knuckles stood out like mountain ridges. Mom was covering her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face, though I couldn't tell if they were from grief, shock, or some combination of both. My Aunt Patricia sat perfectly motionless next to Uncle Tommy, her face a mask of social training that was struggling to contain what looked like volcanic fury. "Sarah has integrity," Margaret's voice continued, echoing off the vaulted ceiling of St. Mark's Cathedral. "She chose a path that mattered to her instead of chasing money or status. She's worked with children who needed her, made a difference in lives that actually needed changing. While the rest of you have been playing games and accumulating toys, she's been building something real. She's the only one who deserves what I've spent my life creating." Marcus had finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper that somehow carried in the stunned silence. "Sarah, what are you doing? This isn't real. Grandma loved all of us equally. She would never have said those things." I finally stood, turning to face the congregation that had come to mourn a woman they thought they knew. "She said those things because they were true," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "And she said them because she was testing all of us to see who we really were when we thought no one was watching." The recording had moved on to a different conversation, one from Christmas dinner 2 years earlier. Margaret's voice was discussing her will with someone, probably her attorney, though we couldn't hear the other side of the conversation. "The construction company will go to Michael and Tommy as planned, but the real assets, the ones they don't know about, those go to Sarah. She's earned them by being the only one who stayed true to herself despite years of pressure to change." Rebecca had finally snapped out of her shock and was pushing past mourners to reach the sound system controls. "Someone help me turn this off," she demanded, her carefully styled hair coming loose as she frantically searched for switches. "This is insane. Sarah's lost her mind. Grandma would be horrified by this spectacle." But I had anticipated this moment. The recording system was password protected, and I had made sure the backup files were loaded and ready. Even if they managed to disconnect my phone, the preset playlist would continue running through the church's internal system. Margaret's preparations had been thorough, and mine had been equally careful. "Let it play," I called out, my teacher's voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary. "Everyone deserves to hear the truth about the woman we're here to remember. The real Margaret Sullivan, not the version you've all created to make yourselves feel better about how you treated the people she actually cared about." The next segment was devastating. Margaret's voice was recounting a conversation she'd had with my parents about my career choice. "Michael keeps apologizing for Sarah's teaching job as if she's doing something shameful. Both he and Linda seem to think I disapprove of her choices, but they've never bothered to ask me directly. They assume I share their embarrassment about having a teacher in the family. The truth is, I'm embarrassed by their lack of backbone. Their daughter is making a real contribution to society, and they're too worried about social status to defend her." Mom's sobbing had become audible, great gasping sounds that echoed Margaret's words. Dad looked like he might collapse, leaning heavily against the pew while staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. They had genuinely believed Margaret disapproved of my career, had spent years apologizing to her for my choices, never realizing she was disappointed in them for their lack of support. The congregation was beginning to fracture. Some people were standing to leave, clearly uncomfortable with what felt like a private family matter being aired in such a public forum. Others seemed riveted by the drama unfolding, perhaps recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in Seattle's typically reserved social circles. A few of Margaret's oldest friends looked knowing, as if they had suspected there was more to her story than she had publicly shared. Marcus had given up trying to reach the sound controls, and instead was approaching me directly, his medical training apparently kicking in as he studied my face for signs of mental breakdown. "Sarah, you're in shock," he said, using the calm professional tone he probably employed with difficult patients. "This isn't you. You would never embarrass the family like this. Let me help you. We can explain to everyone that you're grieving and not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "For the first time in my life, I understand exactly where I stood with Margaret and where I stand with all of you. The question is whether you're ready to hear the rest of what she had to say about your precious family unity." The recording had shifted to a particularly damning segment where Margaret discussed her grandchildren's visits during her illness. "They come by dutifully, but it's obvious they're just fulfilling an obligation. Marcus talks about his cases to impress me, never asking how I'm feeling or what I need. Rebecca brings expensive flowers, and then spends the whole visit checking her phone for business calls. David discusses legal strategies that might benefit the family financially, but he's never once asked about my fears or my hopes for what comes next. Only Sarah sits with me like I'm a person instead of a problem to be managed." Uncle Tommy had finally recovered enough to take action. He strode toward me with the commanding presence that had made him successful in construction management, his face red with anger and humiliation. "Enough," he bellowed, loud enough to compete with the sound system. "I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, Sarah, but this ends now. These recordings are fake, or they're taken out of context, or you've manipulated them somehow. Our mother loved this family equally, and she would never have said these hateful things about her own grandchildren. Fake." I pulled out my phone and held it up so the congregation could see the timestamp and audio file information. "Would you like me to play the conversation where she discusses hiding her real assets from the family, because she knew you'd fight over them? Or maybe the one where she talks about how disappointed she is that her sons raised children who value money more than integrity?" The blood drained from Uncle Tommy's face as he realized I wasn't bluffing. Whatever he had expected this confrontation to be, it wasn't this. He had assumed I was having some kind of emotional breakdown, that the recordings were either fabricated or misunderstood. The possibility that they were genuine, that his mother had actually held these opinions about his family, had never occurred to him. Dad had finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uncertain. "Sarah, honey, even if these recordings are real, this isn't the place for this. People will remember this forever. Your grandmother's reputation, our family's reputation, it'll all be destroyed. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," I said, turning to address the entire congregation rather than just my family, "is for people to understand who Margaret Sullivan really was. Not the sanitized version you've all created, but the brilliant, complex, strategic woman who spent decades building something meaningful while testing whether her family was worthy of what she'd created." The recording had moved on to one of the most shocking segments, where Margaret discussed her financial planning with her attorney. "The construction company is profitable but small compared to my other investments. I've been buying property for 40 years, not just in Seattle but across the Pacific Northwest. The mineral rights alone are worth more than the construction business ever will be. And the stock portfolio, the one I've never mentioned to Michael or Tommy, that's grown to more than they could imagine." A ripple of whispers spread through the congregation as people began to understand that this wasn't just about family dynamics. Margaret Sullivan had apparently been far wealthier than anyone had realized, and she had kept that wealth secret from her own children. The business associates who had come to pay their respects were now paying attention with professional interest, recognizing that they might be learning about investment opportunities or market movements they had never suspected. Rebecca had stopped trying to control the sound system and was now staring at me with naked calculation. "How much?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmur of voices. "How much money are we talking about? What exactly did Grandma hide from us?" "Everything that matters," I replied. "The construction company you all assumed was the family fortune. That's pocket change compared to what she actually built." The house you thought was our most valuable asset. She owned 12 properties across 3 states. The retirement account you expected to inherit. She had investment portfolios worth more than the construction company's annual revenue. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. That's impossible. We would have known. Dad and Uncle Tommy manage all the business finances. There's no way she could have hidden assets of that magnitude without them knowing. She didn't hide them from your fathers, I explained, watching as understanding began to dawn on their faces. She kept them separate because she was planning to leave them to someone who would use them responsibly. Someone who had proven they could make decisions based on principles rather than profit. Someone who wouldn't immediately liquidate everything to fund a more expensive lifestyle. The recording was now playing a conversation between Margaret and her financial advisor about setting up trusts and foundations. Margaret's voice was discussing her plans to establish educational scholarships and community development programs, contingent on finding the right person to oversee them. Sarah understands that money is a tool for creating positive change, not just accumulating possessions. She's the only one who won't use this inheritance to buy bigger houses and fancier cars. She'll actually do something meaningful with it. Dad was shaking his head repeatedly, as if he could make the words disappear through force of will. This can't be happening. Mom would never have kept secrets like this from us. We've been managing her finances for years. We would have seen evidence of these other investments. You managed the finances she let you see, I corrected. The ones that kept you busy and made you feel important. But Margaret was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. She let you think you understood her business while she built something completely different behind the scenes. The congregation was now openly talking among themselves. The reverent atmosphere of the funeral completely shattered. Some people were pulling out phones, presumably to call spouses or business partners with the news that Margaret Sullivan had been playing a much deeper game than anyone had realized. Others were simply staring at our family with the fascination people reserve for natural disasters and public meltdowns. Patricia had been silent throughout the confrontation, but she finally spoke up, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. You're destroying everything she worked for. Whatever point you think you're making, this isn't worth ruining her reputation and our family's standing in the community. People will never forget this spectacle. Good, I replied. Maybe they'll remember that Margaret Sullivan was more than just a successful businesswoman. Maybe they'll remember that she valued character over conformity and integrity over image. Maybe some of them will think twice before they judge people based on their career choices or their bank accounts. The recording had shifted to one of the most personal segments, where Margaret talked about her regrets as a grandmother. I've been too hard on Sarah, but I needed to see if she would break or if she would stay strong. I needed to know if she would change who she was to win my approval or if she would remain true to herself despite the cost. She passed every test I gave her, even when I made those tests cruel and unfair. The others failed by being willing to watch her suffer rather than defending her. They failed by prioritizing their own comfort over family loyalty. Mom's crying had become uncontrollable, her whole body shaking as she processed the implications of what we were all hearing. The woman she had thought disapproved of her daughter had actually been testing the family's willingness to support each other. The grandmother who had seemed dismissive of my career had actually been proud of my choices. The matriarch who had appeared to favor the other grandchildren had been documenting their failures of character and loyalty. Marcus was still trying to maintain control of the situation, probably drawing on his experience managing medical crises. Okay, Sarah, you've made your point. Grandma was more complex than we realized. We obviously misunderstood some things about her opinions and her finances, but this public humiliation isn't helping anyone. Can we please continue this conversation privately? There's nothing private about it anymore, I said, gesturing toward the congregation that was hanging on every word. Margaret recorded these conversations because she wanted them to be heard. She wanted people to understand the choices she made and the reasons behind them. She wanted her real legacy to be known, not just the sanitized version you were planning to present. The final segment of the recording I had selected was the most damning of all. Margaret's voice was crystal clear as she spoke to her attorney about the specific provisions of her will. The family will expect the usual distribution, but that's not what's going to happen. The construction company goes to my sons as planned, but everything else, the real wealth, goes to Sarah. She's earned it by being the only one who stayed true to her values despite years of pressure to conform. The others have shown me exactly who they are when they think no one is watching, and they've proven they're not worthy of what I've built." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in the cathedral sat frozen, processing the implications of what they had just heard. Margaret Sullivan, the woman they had come to memorialize, had structured her will to leave the bulk of her fortune to the grandchild everyone had considered the family. The successful cousins who had delivered eloquent eulogies about their beloved grandmother were about to discover they had inherited almost nothing. Rebecca broke the silence with a sound that was half laugh, half scream. "This is insane. This is absolutely insane." Grandma was obviously suffering from dementia or some kind of mental illness when she made these recordings. No sane person would leave millions of dollars to someone who makes $30,000 a year teaching children. This will never hold up in court. "She made most of these recordings years before her stroke," I replied calmly, "when her mind was completely clear and her business judgment was at its sharpest. And yes, it will hold up in court because she had the best attorneys in Seattle helping her structure everything legally. She spent 5 years planning this moment, making sure every detail was bulletproof." David had been silent throughout the confrontation, but he finally spoke up, his legal training evident in his measured tone. "Even if the recordings are genuine, even if the will is legally valid, you can't seriously expect to inherit millions of dollars while the rest of us get nothing. That's not how families work. We'll contest the will, claim undue influence or diminished capacity. No judge will allow this kind of disparity among grandchildren." "Actually, they will," I said, pulling out a thick envelope from my purse, because Margaret anticipated exactly this reaction. She included detailed documentation of every conversation, every test, every opportunity she gave each of you to show your true character. She has witnesses, recordings and written evidence of everything that's happened over the past 5 years. And she included a clause that anyone who contests the will forfeits even the small bequests they were left. Uncle Tommy looked like he was having a heart attack, his face cycling between red and white as he struggled to process what was happening. "You're lying. You have to be lying. Our mother would never have done this to her own family. She loved all of us equally. She loved all of you," I agreed, "but she didn't respect all of you equally. Love and respect are different things, and Margaret understood that distinction better than anyone. She loved you enough to give you chances to prove yourselves worthy of her respect. You chose not to take those chances." The recording system had finally reached the end of the playlist I had prepared, leaving the cathedral in an eerie silence broken only by the sound of people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The funeral that was supposed to celebrate Margaret Sullivan's life and legacy had become something entirely different, a public revelation of family secrets that would be talked about in Seattle social circles for years to come. Pastor Williams finally stepped forward, clearly struggling to regain control of his own service. "Perhaps we should adjourn to allow the family time to process this information privately," he suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Sullivan's remains will be interred at Lakeview Cemetery, following a brief private ceremony." But no one moved. The congregation seemed to understand that they were witnessing something historic, a public unveiling of secrets that would reshape one of Seattle's most prominent families. The business associates were undoubtedly calculating how these revelations might affect their own dealings with Sullivan and Sons. The social acquaintances were probably already planning which friends to call first with the gossip. Margaret had orchestrated this moment perfectly. She had turned her own funeral into a teaching moment, a final lesson about the difference between appearance and reality, between public image and private truth. She had forced our family to confront our failures in the most public way possible, ensuring that we couldn't hide behind polite lies or social conventions. As I looked around at my family's faces, I saw the exact mix of emotions Margaret had probably predicted. Shock, anger, humiliation, and beneath it all, the dawning realization that their comfortable assumptions about inheritance and family hierarchy had been completely wrong. They had spent years positioning themselves as the successful grandchildren worthy of Margaret's fortune, never suspecting that she valued different qualities entirely. The woman who had called me the family disappointment had actually seen me as the family's salvation. The inheritance they had assumed would be divided among the accomplished cousins was going to the one they had dismissed as a failure. The grandmother who had seemed to criticize my every choice had been documenting everyone else's failures instead. And now, standing in the ruins of their carefully constructed narrative, they would have to decide what to do next. Fight the will and lose everything, or accept that Margaret Sullivan had been playing a game they never understood, with rules they had never learned toward a victory they had never seen coming. 3 days after the funeral, I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Peterson, Hartley and Associates, surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, and family members who could barely look at me. The reading of Margaret's will was supposed to be a formality, a legal confirmation of what everyone already knew. Instead, it had become the final act of a drama that began when I pressed play on that recording. Margaret's attorney, William Peterson, was a man in his 70s who had handled the Sullivan family's legal affairs for over 3 decades. He sat at the head of the polished table with a leather portfolio that contained documents none of us had ever seen, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the assembled family. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like breathing through cotton. Dad and Uncle Tommy sat rigidly in their chairs, both looking like they had aged 10 years in the past week. Mom hadn't stopped crying since the funeral, her eyes red and swollen from grief and shock. Aunt Patricia maintained her composure through sheer social training, but I could see the fury simmering beneath her perfectly applied makeup. My cousins were arranged around the table like defendants awaiting sentencing, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Before we begin," Peterson said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in high-stakes legal proceedings, "I want to acknowledge that some of you have already heard portions of Mrs. Sullivan's true intentions through the recordings played at her service. However, the complete scope of her estate and her reasoning behind its distribution has not been fully revealed until today." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his medical training apparently unable to help him diagnose or treat the situation he found himself in. "Mr. Peterson, we need to discuss the validity of those recordings. My grandmother was clearly not in her right mind when she made them. The things she said about our family, about me personally, they don't reflect the woman we knew and loved." Peterson opened his portfolio with deliberate slowness, removing a thick stack of documents that had been notarized, witnessed, and sealed with the kind of legal precision that comes from years of careful planning. "Mrs. Sullivan began planning this distribution in 2018, well before any signs of cognitive decline. Every decision was made with full mental capacity, documented by multiple physicians, and reviewed annually to ensure her continued satisfaction with the arrangements." Rebecca leaned forward, her business instincts overriding her emotional shock. "What exactly are we talking about in terms of assets?" The funeral recording mentioned properties and investments we knew nothing about. "We need specifics before we can evaluate our options." "Your options are limited," Peterson replied bluntly. Mrs. Sullivan was quite thorough in her planning, specifically because she anticipated this exact conversation. "But to answer your question directly, the total estate value is approximately $47 million, not including the ongoing revenue from various business ventures and property holdings." The number hit the room like a physical blow. Even I, who had heard portions of the recordings, and suspected Margaret's wealth extended far beyond what the family knew, felt my breath catch. $47 million was an incomprehensible sum, enough to transform lives, fund dreams, or destroy relationships forever. Uncle Tommy found his voice first, though it came out as a croak. $47 million, that's impossible. We manage all of Mom's finances. The construction company, the house, her investment accounts, we've seen everything. The total couldn't be more than 8 or 10 million, and most of that is tied up in business assets. You managed the finances she allowed you to see, Peterson corrected. Mrs. Sullivan maintained separate investment portfolios, property holdings, and business interests that she deliberately kept private. She wanted to observe how her family behaved when they believed they understood her financial situation, versus how they might behave if they knew the true scope of her wealth. Dad was shaking his head slowly, as if he could make the information disappear through sheer denial. This doesn't make sense. We worked together for 40 years. I handled her books, managed her accounts, discussed every major financial decision. How could she hide that much money? Because she was significantly more sophisticated in her financial planning than you realized, Peterson explained. Mrs. Sullivan established trusts, shell corporations, and investment vehicles that operated independently of the construction business. She purchased properties through different entities, invested in markets you weren't involved with, and built a portfolio that grew exponentially over several decades. I had been silent through this exchange, still processing the magnitude of what Margaret had accomplished. The woman who had criticized my modest teacher's salary had been managing an empire that generated more money in a year than I would make in a lifetime. The grandmother who had seemed obsessed with traditional markers of success had been operating on a level none of us had even imagined. Peterson continued reading from the documents, his voice steady and professional as he outlined the specific bequests. To my son Michael Sullivan, I leave the family home in Queen Anne and $500,000, with the understanding that he will use these resources to reflect on the differences between financial success and personal integrity. Dad's face went white as he processed what he was hearing. After 4 decades of working in the family business, of dedicating his career to building what he thought was their shared legacy, he was receiving what amounted to a comfortable but modest inheritance. The construction company he had helped manage wasn't even being left to him directly. To my son Thomas Sullivan, I leave the Sullivan Sons Construction Company in its entirety, along with all associated equipment, contracts, and business relationships, valued at approximately $3.2 million. I trust he will continue to operate it with the integrity and work ethic his father instilled. Uncle Tommy's relief was visible, though it was tempered by the realization that the business he had assumed was the crown jewel of Margaret's empire was actually just a small fraction of her total wealth. He would inherit the company, but not the fortune that could have funded its expansion or secured his retirement in luxury. To my daughter-in-law Patricia Sullivan, I leave $200,000 and my jewelry collection, in recognition of her dedication to maintaining family traditions and social obligations. Patricia's composure finally cracked slightly, a muscle in her jaw twitching as she calculated the disparity between what she was receiving and what she had expected. The woman who had spent decades positioning herself as Margaret's successor in Seattle society was being dismissed with what amounted to a generous but clearly secondary bequest. Peterson moved on to the grandchildren, and I could feel the tension ratchet higher as my cousins waited to learn their fates. To my grandson Marcus Sullivan, I leave $100,000, with the hope that he will use this sum to remember that medicine is a calling to serve others, not a path to personal enrichment. Marcus looked like he had been slapped. The grandson who had been held up as the family's greatest success, the doctor who was supposed to carry on the Sullivan legacy of achievement, was receiving less than some family friends had probably been left in Margaret's will. To my grandson David Sullivan, I leave $100,000, with the encouragement to use his legal training to protect those who cannot protect themselves, rather than simply advancing his own career. David's legal mind was already working, probably calculating whether the amounts being distributed would leave enough in the estate to make a contest worthwhile. But Peterson's next words seemed to anticipate his thoughts. To my granddaughter Rebecca Sullivan, I leave $100,000, with the reminder that true business success comes from creating value for others, not simply accumulating wealth for oneself. Rebecca's face had gone through several color changes as she listened to the bequests, clearly struggling to reconcile the modest sum she was receiving with her understanding of her grandmother's affection and approval. The woman who had positioned herself as Margaret's natural successor in business was being relegated to the same tier as her male cousins. Peterson paused, allowing the weight of these announcements to settle over the room before continuing with the portion of the will that everyone knew was coming, but no one wanted to hear. To my granddaughter Sarah Chen, who has demonstrated integrity, compassion and strength of character despite years of familial pressure to conform to others' expectations of success, I leave the remainder of my estate. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The remainder of a $47 million estate, minus the relatively modest bequests that had just been announced, represented a fortune that would fundamentally change, not just my life, but my ability to impact the lives of others on a scale I had never imagined possible. This includes, Peterson continued, the property holdings in Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, and San Francisco, valued at approximately $18 million. The investment portfolios managed through Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, currently valued at $21 million. The mineral rights and land holdings in eastern Washington, valued at approximately $4 million. And various business interests and ongoing revenue streams, valued at an additional $3.5 million. I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching this scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, like statistics from a news report rather than a description of my personal circumstances. I had gone from being the family disappointment with a teacher's salary to controlling more wealth than everyone else in the room combined. Marcus was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice carrying a desperate edge that I had never heard before. This isn't fair. This isn't what Grandma would have wanted if she had been thinking clearly. Sarah's a teacher. She doesn't know anything about managing investments or business interests. She'll lose everything within 5 years. On the contrary, Peterson replied, Mrs. Sullivan spent considerable time evaluating each grandchild's character, judgment, and values before making this decision.
She specifically chose Sarah because she demonstrated the wisdom to prioritize principles over profit, the integrity to maintain her values despite social pressure, and the compassion to use resources for the benefit of others rather than personal aggrandizement. Rebecca had recovered from her initial shock, and was now in full business mode, leaning forward with the predatory focus that had made her successful in real estate. There has to be a way to challenge this. Undue influence, diminished capacity, something. No rational person leaves this kind of disparity among family members. Grandma must have been manipulated or coerced. Any attempt to contest this will, Peterson said, his tone becoming noticeably colder, will result in the immediate forfeiture of all bequests to the contesting parties. Mrs. Sullivan was quite specific about this provision. She anticipated that some family members might attempt to challenge her decisions through legal means, and she viewed such attempts as final confirmation that they were unworthy of her legacy. David's legal training kicked in as he began searching for loopholes or technicalities that might provide some avenue for challenge. What about the no contest clause? Those aren't always enforceable, especially when there are questions about capacity or undue influence. We could argue that the clause itself is evidence of coercion. You could argue that Peterson agreed, but you would lose. Mrs. Sullivan had herself evaluated by 3 independent physicians annually for the past 5 years specifically to establish her mental competency. She consulted with 4 different law firms to ensure the ironclad nature of her will. She even had portions of her decision-making process filmed and witnessed by neutral parties to prevent exactly the kind of challenge you're contemplating. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Margaret hadn't just planned this distribution, she had anticipated every possible objection and closed every potential loophole. She had spent years building a legal fortress around her decisions, ensuring that her final wishes would be carried out regardless of her family's reactions. Uncle Tommy was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between bewilderment and accusation. Sarah, you had to have known something about this. People don't just stumble into $40 million inheritances. You must have influenced her somehow, convinced her to change her will. I had no idea, I replied honestly. I thought I was the family disappointment, remember? I thought Grandma disapproved of everything about my life. I found out about her real feelings the same way you did, through recordings I discovered 3 days before she died. Mom had been crying steadily throughout the reading, but now she looked up with red, swollen eyes. Sarah, honey, what are you going to do? This is so much money. This is going to change everything about our family, about your life. Are you ready for this kind of responsibility? The question hit me harder than all the legal details and financial figures. What was I going to do? Margaret had entrusted me with a fortune that could fund scholarship programs, support community development projects, or simply provide financial security for generations of my family. but she had also handed me the power to reshape family dynamics that had been entrenched for decades. "I'm going to honor Margaret's intentions," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "She didn't leave me this money to spite the rest of you or to reward me for being her favorite. She left it to me because she believed I would use it responsibly, according to the values she tried to teach all of us." Rebecca let out a bitter laugh. "Values? What values? Grandma was cruel to you for years. She criticized everything you did, made you feel worthless, treated you like the family failure. Now you're going to honor her intentions. That's either sainthood or stupidity." "It was neither cruel nor random," I explained, thinking back to the recordings I had discovered. "Margaret was testing all of us. She wanted to see who would compromise their principles for approval, who would defend family members under attack, who would maintain their integrity despite social pressure. I passed her tests not because I was perfect, but because I refused to change who I was to win her approval." David was still working the legal angles, apparently unable to accept that his grandmother had outmaneuvered him so completely. "Even if the will is legally valid, there are tax implications here that could significantly reduce the actual inheritance. Estate taxes on $47 million could be substantial." Peterson nodded approvingly, as if he had been waiting for someone to raise this point. "Mrs. Sullivan established trusts and charitable foundations that will minimize the tax burden while ensuring the money is used according to her wishes. The inheritance includes detailed plans for establishing the Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Education and Community Development, which will provide tax advantages while funding the causes she cared about most." This was the piece I had been waiting to hear. Margaret hadn't just left me a fortune, she had provided a framework for using it responsibly. The foundation would allow me to support education initiatives, community development projects, and social programs while maintaining the family's financial security and minimizing the tax burden. Marcus was shaking his head in disbelief, apparently still unable to process how dramatically his expectations had been overturned. "This is insane. I'm a doctor. I save lives every day. Rebecca builds businesses that employ people. David helps clients navigate complex legal issues. We're all successful, contributing members of society. But Sarah teaches elementary school, and somehow that makes her more deserving of millions of dollars." "It's not about the job," I replied, finally understanding what Margaret had been trying to teach us all along. "It's about the person doing the job. You save lives, but you chose medicine because it was prestigious and lucrative. Rebecca builds businesses, but she's more interested in profit margins than employee welfare. David practices law, but he's focused on advancing his career rather than serving justice. I teach because I believe education matters, regardless of what it pays or how others perceive it." The truth was settling over the room like dust after an explosion. Margaret Sullivan had spent decades observing her family, testing their values, and documenting their choices. She had created elaborate scenarios to see how each person would behave when they thought no one was watching, when they believed their actions had no consequences. Dad was still struggling to understand how his mother had hidden so much from him for so long. The business meetings, the financial discussions, the planning sessions we had every month for 40 years, was any of it real, or was she just humoring me while she built this secret empire? "It was all real," Peterson assured him. "Mrs. Sullivan valued your contribution to the construction company and trusted you to manage those operations effectively. But she also recognized that your vision was limited to the business you knew, while her interests and investments extended far beyond construction." Patricia finally spoke up, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is going to destroy our family. Our friends, our social circle, everyone we know is going to hear about this eventually. How do we explain that our mother-in-law left almost everything to the granddaughter we've spent years apologizing for?" "Maybe you stop apologizing," I suggested quietly. "Maybe you start recognizing that different kinds of success have different kinds of value. Maybe you realize that Margaret's disappointment wasn't with my career choice, but with your inability to support a family member who was following her conscience instead of chasing status." The meeting was winding down, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. Peterson distributed copies of the relevant documents, contact information for the various financial institutions and legal entities involved, and a timeline for the transfer of assets. The practical aspects of inheriting $47 million, it turned out, were surprisingly complex and would take months to fully execute. As we prepared to leave, Uncle Tommy made one last attempt to find some middle ground, some way to salvage the family relationships that had been shattered by Margaret's revelations. "Sarah, I know we haven't always been fair to you. Maybe we didn't understand what Mom was trying to teach us. But we're still family. Surely there's a way to work together on this, to find a distribution that makes sense for everyone." I looked around the table at faces that had been part of my entire life, people who had shaped my understanding of family, success, and belonging. They weren't evil people, but they had failed the tests that mattered most to Margaret. They had prioritized their own comfort over family loyalty, chosen social approval over personal integrity, and valued appearance over substance. "The distribution has already been made," I said gently. "Margaret spent 5 years deciding how to divide her legacy, and she chose to reward the values she believed in. I'm not going to second-guess her decisions or try to fix what she saw as justice, but that doesn't mean we can't rebuild our relationships going forward." Rebecca's business instincts were still working, even in the face of defeat. "What about the foundation? There might be opportunities for partnership, for combining our different skills and resources to build something larger than any of us could create individually." For the first time since the funeral, I felt a spark of hope for our family's future. Rebecca was right that we all had different strengths and perspectives that could complement each other, even if the financial dynamics had shifted dramatically. The foundation would need board members, advisors, and people with various professional expertise. The foundation will have opportunities for everyone who wants to contribute meaningfully, I agreed. But participation will be based on commitment to the mission, not family relationships or financial expectations. Margaret left detailed guidelines about the values and principles she wanted the foundation to embody. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the conference room, I realized that Margaret's final lesson was still unfolding. She hadn't just redistributed wealth, she had forced us all to confront our assumptions about fairness, merit, and family obligation. The grandmother who had called me the family disappointment had revealed that disappointment was a matter of perspective, and that sometimes the people who seem to be failing are actually passing tests that others don't even recognize. Walking out of Peterson's office into the Seattle afternoon, I felt the weight of responsibility settling over me like a heavy coat. $47 million wasn't just money, it was the power to transform lives, support causes, and create lasting change. Margaret had entrusted me with the resources to build something meaningful, but she had also challenged me to prove worthy of that trust every day going forward. The family dynamics that had defined my entire life had been permanently altered, but perhaps they had been altered for the better. Instead of competing for approval from someone who valued conformity over authenticity, we could now focus on building relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. Instead of measuring success by traditional markers of achievement, we could explore what it meant to create value for others, rather than simply accumulating wealth for ourselves. Margaret Sullivan had spent her final years orchestrating the most elaborate lesson any of us would ever receive. She had taught us that true success isn't about meeting other people's expectations, but about maintaining your integrity regardless of the cost. She had shown us that family loyalty means defending each other's right to be different, not demanding conformity to shared standards. And she had demonstrated that the most valuable inheritance isn't money, but the wisdom to use whatever resources you have in service of something larger than yourself. The woman who had called me the family disappointment had given me the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that I had never been a disappointment at all. I had been exactly who she hoped I would become, and now I had the resources to prove her faith in me was justified. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.